They didn't even look at her face. That's the part that still gets people when they hear this story. Not the shouting. Not the security guard's hands on her shoulders. Not the moment she was actually pushed, toward the revolving door of the Hargrove Tower lobby in downtown Calgary. It's the fact that not one person in that building looked her face long enough to see who she was. Her name was Octavia Sinclair-Webb, 51 years old. Born in Scarborough, raised in Mississauga, spent 3 decades building something most people only dream about from the outside. She had the kind of quiet that made rooms feel different, not because she demanded attention, but because she had learned a long time ago that attention was something other people needed. She did not. On the morning of November 14th, she walked into the lobby of Hargrove Financial Group, wearing a charcoal gray sweater, dark jeans, and a pair of worn leather boots she'd had resoled twice. She was carrying a manila folder and a cup of Tim Hortons coffee, medium, double-double, same as she'd been ordering since university. She had a meeting scheduled on the 31st floor. She had taken the 7:15 train from her home in Rosedale. She had, by her own account, been in a perfectly good mood. She made it about 12 feet past the front entrance before the guard stopped her. His name was Darren Price. He was tall, wide across the shoulders, and he wore the kind of expression that certain men put on when they have been given a uniform and told that the uniform means something. He stepped directly into her path. Not to the side, not with a polite gesture. Directly in front of her, so that she had to stop or walk into him. "Can I help you?" he said. Not a question. The kind of sentence that arrives already knowing its answer. Octavia looked at him. "I have a meeting. 31st floor. I'm expected." "With who? Excuse me. Who are you meeting with?" She was used to this. She had been used to this for 30 years. The pause before the question. The question that isn't really a question. She reached into her folder and produced the meeting confirmation. Printed. Because she always printed, and held it out toward him. He didn't take it. "You can't just walk in off the street," he said. "This is a private building." "I'm aware it's a private building," she said. "I've been in this building before." Something shifted in his expression then. A kind of decision. Like he had already determined where this was going, and was now simply performing the steps in order. "I'm going to need you to wait outside," he said. "Or I'm going to have to ask you to leave. I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Ma'am." "Don't call me ma'am." He called for backup. That's what he did. He pressed the radio clip to his chest and said, in a voice clearly meant to be heard by everyone in the lobby, "I've got a situation at the front entrance." And Octavia, standing there with her coffee and her folder and her resoled boots, understood with sudden and absolute clarity that she was the situation. There were people in that lobby. A woman at the reception desk who had looked up and then looked back down. 2 men in suits near the elevator bay who had stopped their conversation. A young woman with a lanyard around her neck who was staring at her phone with the focused intensity of someone who very much wanted to be looking at their phone. A second guard appeared from the side hallway. His name, she would later find out, was Ethan Beaumont. He was younger than Price, softer around the edges, and he looked genuinely uncertain about what he was walking into. He took in the scene. Octavia standing calmly, Price with his chest slightly forward, and seemed to reach for the nearest available script. "What's the issue here?" Beaumont asked. "Trespassing," Price said. Octavia set her coffee down on the marble ledge beside her. She did this carefully. She did not want to spill it. She was aware, even then, of how she looked to the people watching her. She was aware that any gesture she made would be read a certain way. This is something that black women in this country learn to be aware of. Not because they want to, because the alternative is worse. "I am not trespassing," she said. "I have a scheduled meeting with the CFO of this company. I am going to call upstairs and confirm that, and then I am going to get on the elevator." She reached into her pocket for her phone, and that is when Darren Price put his hand on her arm. Not a tap, not a guiding gesture. His hand closed around her forearm, the arm holding the manila folder, and he turned her, physically turned her, toward the door. And in the turning, the folder opened. The papers inside, the confirmation, the agenda, the 3-page summary she had prepared. slid out and scattered across the marble floor. She pulled her arm back. She said very clearly, "Do not touch me." He grabbed her by both shoulders. What happened next took maybe 6 seconds. She lost her balance. He was steering her toward the door, and she was pulling away, and her boot caught the edge of the floor mat, and she went down. Not thrown exactly, but not caught either. Her left knee hit the marble. Her right palm hit the marble. The Tim Hortons cup, which had been on the ledge, somehow ended up on the floor too, the lid popping off, coffee spreading in a slow brown arc. She stayed down for a moment. Not because she was injured, though her knee would bruise badly, and her palm would be sore for a week. She stayed down because she was taking stock of what had just happened. She was counting the people who had seen it. The woman at reception. The 2 men in suits. The young woman with the lanyard, who was no longer looking at her phone. Nobody moved. Ethan Beaumont took a step forward, then stopped. Darren Price said, "I told you to leave." Octavia Sinclair-Webb got up off the marble floor of the Hargrove Financial Group lobby, gathered 3 of the papers that had fallen within reach, and walked out through the revolving door. She did not run. She did not cry. She stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and called her lawyer, a woman her Rochel, T.S.E., who had been her legal counsel for 11 years. And she said, "I need you to document everything I'm about to tell you. If you're finding this story hard to sit with, good. You should. Because what happened to Octavia Sinclair-Webb in that lobby is not unusual. It is not a freak incident. It is something that happens in lobbies and offices and boardrooms and hotel entrances in this country more often than most people want to acknowledge. The uniform, the assumption, the hand on the arm, the floor. What makes this story different is what happened next. Now, if you haven't already, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because what part of this story did in the 48 hours that followed is the part of this story that most people don't see coming. And you're going to want to be here for it. The meeting she had been on her way to, the one on the 31st floor, had been scheduled for 9 a.m. By 9:07, when she had not arrived, her contact on the 31st floor, a man named Stephen Ogilvy, who held the title of Chief Financial Officer, called her cell phone. She let it ring. She was still on the sidewalk. She was still on with Rachel Tae. By 9:15, Stephen Ogilvy had been told by his assistant that there had been an incident at the lobby level involving a visitor. He went downstairs himself. He saw the spilled coffee on the marble. He saw Darren Price standing near the entrance with the expression of a man who had done his job. He asked what had happened. Price told him there had been an unauthorized individual attempting to access the building. Stephen Ogilvy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What did she like?" Price described her. Ogilvy said, "That was Octavia Sinclair-Webb." Price said nothing. "Do you know who that is?" Ogilvy asked. Price said nothing. Stephen Ogilvy was not a dramatic man. He did not shout. He did not fire anyone on the spot. He went back upstairs, sat down at his desk, and called the office of the Hargrove Group CEO, a man named David Hargrove, Jr., and said 4 words. "We have a problem." What Darren Price did not know, except almost no one in that building on the 31st floor and above knew, was that Octavia Sinclair-Webb was not simply a guest. She was not a vendor, not a contractor, not someone's colleague coming in for a routine meeting. She was, as of 6 weeks earlier, the majority shareholder of a 34% stake in Hargrove Financial Group, acquired through a private transaction that had not yet been made public. The meeting she was attending that morning was, in fact, the final pre-announcement briefing before the press release went out the following day. She had earned the money for that stake over 3 decades. She had started at 22 with an entry-level position at a credit union in Brampton, working nights to finish her finance degree. She had moved through 4 companies in 15 years, rising slowly and then quickly, the way things sometimes go when talent meets exactly the right amount of stubbornness. She had founded her own investment firm, Webb Capital Partners, at 39, in the spare bedroom of a semi-detached on Danforth Avenue, with 2 clients and a second-hand laptop. By the time she was 50, she had 46 clients, 2 offices, one in Toronto, one in Vancouver, and a reputation for seeing value in companies that other investors had written off too soon. She had seen value in Hargrove Group 2 years ago. She had been patient. She had done the work. And she had walked into that building on a Tuesday morning in November, not as a supplicant, not as someone seeking access, but as someone who had already earned the right to be there many times over. None of that was visible on the outside. That was, she would later say, rather the point. By noon on November 14th, the situation inside Hargrove Tower had become what Stephen Ogilvy would later describe, with some understatement, as a significant internal issue. David Hargrove Jr. had spent the morning on the phone. The company's head of security, a woman named Margaret Dolan, had reviewed the lobby footage and called it deeply concerning. Legal had been looped in. HR had been looped in. The board liaison had been looped in. Nobody had called Octavia. She called them. She called Stephen Ogilvy at 12:30 and said, in the same even tone she'd used on the sidewalk that morning, "I've had my lawyer send a formal account of the incident to your legal team. I've also filed a report with the Calgary Police Service. I'd like to reschedule the briefing for this afternoon, if that's possible. I'm still interested in completing the transaction." Ogilvy apparently said something like, "Octavia, I don't know what to say," she said. "I know, but the press release is still going out tomorrow and there's work to do." That is the kind of person she was. That is the thing that people who know her still talk about. Not that she was calm. People use calm like it's an absence of feeling. She was not calm. She was furious. She would say so later, plainly and without apology. But she had learned, decades ago, that fury and focus are not opposites. You can hold both. And she had things to accomplish. The rescheduled briefing took place at 3 p.m. that afternoon. Not in the Hargrove Tower. In Octavia's Toronto office, they flew in on short notice. Stephen Ogilvy came. 2 members of the board came. David Hargrove Jr. came, and he sat across from Octavia Sinclair-Webb at her conference table, and he had the look of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the ground had shifted under him considerably. She shook his hand. She offered coffee. She sat down and opened her folder, a new one, since the original was still somewhere on the marble floor in Calgary. And she got to work. That is who she was. The press release went out the following morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. It announced the completion of Octavia Sinclair-Webb's acquisition of a 34% stake in Hargrove Financial Group, making her the largest individual shareholder in the company's history. The release included a quote from David Hargrove Jr., describing her as a visionary investor whose partnership represents a new chapter for Hargrove Group. It included a quote from Octavia about the company's potential and her long-term commitment to its growth. It did not mention what had happened in the lobby the day before. The story came out anyway. These things always do. A source, never identified, but widely suspected to be Ethan Beaumont, the younger guard, who had stood uncertain in the lobby that morning, told a reporter at the Globe and Mail that the majority shareholder of Hargrove Group had been physically removed from the lobby of Hargrove Tower the day before the announcement. The reporter called Octavia's office for comment. Octavia's communications director, a man named Theo Adkins, said she would speak on the record. And she did. The interview ran on a Thursday. By Friday, it had been picked up by 14 outlets. By the following Monday, now before we get to what happened to Darren Price and to David Hargrove Jr., let me just say, if this story is hitting you somewhere, leave a comment below. Tell me who you're thinking about right now, because I think a lot of people watching this know someone like Octavia. Or maybe they know what it feels like to be her. What happened to Darren Price was this: he was terminated. The termination was announced internally on the Friday, 2 days after the press release. The company cited a serious breach of professional conduct and the organization's values. A source close to the matter, again, never publicly identified, said the decision had been made at the highest level. There was a public statement from Margaret Dolan, head of security, expressing the company's deepest regret and confirming that a full review of lobby security protocols was underway. There was a separate statement from David Hargrove Jr. that ran to 4 paragraphs and managed somehow to say very little while occupying considerable space. Octavia did not comment on Price's termination. When the Globe reporter asked her about it directly, she said, That's a matter between him and his former employer. I don't have anything to add. The reporter pushed. Do you think it was the right outcome? Octavia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I think accountability matters. I also think one person losing a job doesn't change the thing that made that morning possible. The assumption that walked through that door before I did, that didn't come from one security guard. It came from somewhere much bigger than him. That quote ran as the headline. What happened to David Hargrove Jr. was more complicated and more interesting. He had been, until that week, a man with a certain kind of standing. Third generation of a Calgary family that had built a financial institution from the ground up. He had a photograph in his office, people said, of his grandfather at the original Hargrove Trust branch on 8th Avenue, 1961. He was proud of that lineage. He had reason to be. And then Octavia Sinclair-Webb walked into his company, or rather, was pushed out of it, and the story of Hargrove Group changed. Not because she wanted to change it, not because she had come in with any agenda other than the transaction she had already agreed to complete, but because the lobby had made visible something that had been invisible, and once something becomes visible, you can't unsee it. In the weeks after the announcement, Hargrove Group's board commissioned an internal equity review. This had not been planned. It was Octavia who suggested it, quietly, in a meeting with 2 board members in mid-December. She didn't demand it, she didn't threaten. She simply said, I think it would be useful to understand the culture we're actually working with, not the one we assume we have. The board agreed. The review took 4 months. Its findings were not made public in full, but several of the changes that followed were a new hiring framework, a revised training program for all client-facing staff, and the appointment of a chief inclusion officer, a position that had not previously existed at Hargrove Group. The person appointed to that role was Ethan Beaumont, not Darren Price. Ethan Beaumont, the young guard who had stepped forward and then stopped, who had seen everything, who had eventually made a choice about what to do with what he had seen. Octavia had recommended him. People ask her about that, sometimes. Why him? He had been there. He had witnessed the whole thing, and he hadn't intervened, hadn't said a word in her defense, had stood there with that uncertain expression, while she picked herself up off the marble floor. Why would she recommend him for anything? She said in one interview that ran in Canadian Business the following spring. Ethan didn't do the right thing in the moment. He knows that. He said so publicly more than once. But after, when it mattered in a different way, he did. He told the truth about what he had seen. He didn't have to. There was no guarantee it would go well for him, but he did it anyway. That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot. She paused. I'm less interested in who people were in the worst moment than in who they choose to be after it. That's where character actually lives. Darren Price did not speak to the press. He never has, as far as anyone knows. There is no record of him attempting to contact Octavia directly. He was 44 years old at the time of the incident. What became of him after is not something that was widely reported, and Octavia never spoke about him again, beyond that single answer to the Globe reporter. Some stories don't have a scene where the person looks the other person in the eye and speaks the words. Sometimes accountability is quieter than that. Sometimes it is simply the door closing, and the silence after. The thing Octavia Sinclair-Webb says, when people ask her what she wants them to take from all of this, is not what most people expect. They expect something about resilience, something about rising above, something that can be put on a motivational poster and shared 1,200 times before breakfast. What she actually says is this: I want people to understand that I should not have had to rise above anything that morning. I shouldn't have had to be patient or dignified or strategic. I should have been able to walk into a building where I was expected, attend a meeting, and go home. That's it. That's what I wanted. And the fact that a story about that is inspiring to people, the fact that it went viral and people called it remarkable, that is the thing that should make all of us uncomfortable. Because it means we have accepted, somewhere deep down, that what happened to me is normal. I don't accept that. I never have. She said that, and then she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, anyway. There's a lot of work to do, and she went back to work. That's who Octavia Sinclair-Webb is. A woman who walked into a building on a Tuesday morning was pushed to the floor, got up, called her lawyer, rescheduled the meeting, completed the transaction, sat across from the man who ran the company she had just bought a third of, shook his hand, and got back to work. A woman who, when asked to describe what she hoped for, said something about a morning where none of this would have been remarkable at all. Sometimes the person in the worn leather boots is the one who owns the floor you just pushed her onto. Remember that. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Birthright Tales. We put out new stories every week, and every one of them is about someone the world almost missed. Until next time.